So the interview has three parts. The first part is questions about the themes of colonialism and empire.
Yes.
The second part is about your life experience.
Yes.
And the third part is about objects.
Yes.
And then the very last part is about just a couple of follow-up questions at the end. All right, let's get started then. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation with you.
Yes.
Let me know when you can see it.
Yeah, not yet. It's the little, yeah, got it now.
Okay, so let's get started. So the first question is about colonialism in the British Empire.
Yes.
So when I say the word colonialism, what does it make you think of and how does it make you feel? And can you explain why?
When I see or hear the word colonialism, it tends to make me think of a negative thing when the empire wasn't. That's my initial thought.
When the empire wasn't, what do you mean?
Yes, yeah, you know that the colonialism, it almost seems like I suppose a dirty word now.
Okay. And does it trigger any particular emotions?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Does the word colonialism trigger any particular emotions? Sadness, fear, loathing?
No, I think it just sort of, it seems a negative term now, I suppose, because we're so bombarded with, you know, an attempted guilt of empire. I think that that's my initial sort of feeling anyway. Okay,
and how about the words British Empire? Do they make you think of similar things or different things?
No, I think of that in a positive way.
Can you explain why?
Well, I suppose sort of my view of the empire was that you know the sort of the unique fibre of the Celtic Saxon people and the sort of the divine sort of providence that they seem to have to set the empire up, sort of inbuilt, that the British people would do good around the world.
Okay. So in terms of emotions, does it trigger any particular emotions?
Pride, I suppose, and sadness at its dismantling.
Okay. And when you're thinking about sadness about it dismantling, are you thinking about particular countries?
I would think of, you know, sort of, I suppose the worst one or the best example of would be, you know, how Rhodesia was treated and, you know, what became of it later.
Okay, bye. Okay. Why Rhodesia in particular?
Because it was the breadbasket of Africa, and after Mugabe took over, sort of over the next 20 years, he just sort of drove it into the ground.
Okay, and you think if the British Empire hadn't ended or if independence hadn't happened, that would not have happened?
Well, I think it had the Rhodesian front been allowed to continue, because obviously apartheid didn't exist in Rhodesia. The bulk of the army were actually black, and you know, a lot of them were perfectly happy. It was the communist guerrillas, and because Ian Smith had to declare UDI, and Rhodesia effectively stood alone. After sort of holding the hordes back for 15 years, she could sort of no longer do it.
Okay, thank you. So the next questions then are about your own experience and background. Do you think that growing up you were surrounded by symbols of the British Empire? And if you were, what were they? And where did you see them? And what did people in your life say about them?
No, I wouldn't really agree with that. I think my interest in history, I suppose, and reading when I left school, I think Britain's one of these funny countries where we don't teach the children sort of post. I certainly didn't study British history after the Tudor period. And I don't necessarily, perhaps it's strange to say, don't necessarily equate sort of the flags and emblems that we would have seen here with the empire in that way. I would think that is more a political thing here.
Okay. And growing up, did you have any experiences of colonialism? For example, did you ever live or work in a British colony or former colony?
No.
And how about any other members of your family or your extended network of friends?
I had an uncle who was a colonel in India during the Second World War.
And what did he tell you about those experiences, or did anybody else tell you?
Fortunately, I never met him. He died when I was quite young.
Was he spoken about within the family?
Yes. Everybody was sort of quite proud of him because he'd had a good war. He'd started World War II as a senior non-commissioned officer, but finished the war as a colonel.
Okay, so people were proud of him and
talked
about him with respect. And did he die in India or in Ireland, or where did he die?
No, he died of natural causes in London.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. So the next set of questions then is about Ireland.
Yes.
Do you think Ireland, as in the 32 counties before partition, and after that the Republic of Ireland, the 26 counties, was that land block a British colony, or is it now?
I suppose certain sections of the community would perceive it that way. But when I think of the British Isles, I think of Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales in their entirety. Through my work, I see a sort of a terrible amount of confliction, where in World War II alone, the British government had 110,000 next of kin addresses for British service personnel for the 26 counties. And of course, a lot of the people who came actually used English accommodation addresses. So we'll never know, but it was certainly well in excess of 110,000 who came and volunteered and fought.
Mm-hmm. So you think of the British Isles as a complete unit?
Yes. The empire was built. I used to tease them. I went to the University of Birmingham, and I used to tease them with the old saying: "The Irish won the empire, the Scottish administered it, and the English kept the money." And it used to annoy them.
And how about Northern Ireland? Do you think it is or was a British colony?
No, I don't think so. Because not in that way. Because the plantation it was so long ago, and effectively we've been here sort of for 400 or 500 years and assimilated through. Obviously, my family were originally indigenous Catholics, but after 400 years. I'm a Protestant former British soldier.
Mm-hmm. And when you say we've been here, who is that we that you referred to?
I suppose the descendants of the planters.
Being from Scotland.
Yes, although it's much more nuanced, I suppose. Me being an example of whatever percentage, 50-50, half local, if you want to term it that way, and half from GB.
Okay, thank you. So what about artifacts in your family growing up? did you have any artifacts, by which I mean it could be an intangible artifact like a family story, or letters, photos, photo albums, diaries, souvenirs, medals, uniforms, anything like that that was collected in a colony outside of Northern Ireland?
No, unfortunately not. I've collected medals since I was a child, but those are ones I purchased. We didn't have any family medals, and unfortunately, I didn't get Uncle Ted's. They disappeared into the ether somewhere. He was the Indian colonel.
And was he Ted Maguire as well?
No, he was a Rose.
Okay.
The Reconnaissance Corps.
And how about those medals that you collected? What made you become interested in collecting medals?
I was just always fascinated in soldiers and battles and history. And as I moved into adulthood, I had a certain amount of disposable income, which allowed me to indulge my interests. Building up a library for myself and purchasing medals.
Mm-hmm. And did you ever serve in a former colony or a colony?
No. Germany was as far as I got.
But you were in the Royal Irish, were you?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the next slides then are about objects. So these objects that you see on this slide in front of you are all from National Museums Northern Ireland.
Yes.
And thank you to them for sharing images and information about their World Cultures collection. Would you please pick 3 objects, and I'll tell you a bit about them, and then ask you some questions.
But you don't need to click on them, just ask you.
Yes, just choose them.
The Chinese ivory ball.
Mm-hmm.
The carved figurine.
Is that the one to the left of the ball?
The central top.
Okay.
And decisions. The Buddha.
Okay, thank you. So the first object then is a figure made of bark cloth and cane, and it's from Rapa Nui, or Easter Island as it's also known. And it's an amazing object because it's one of only 3 in the world, and the other 2 are in the Peabody Museum in Harvard. And this object was collected by Gordon Augustus Thompson in 1837 or 1840. Gordon Augustus Thompson was the son of one of the founders of the Belfast Banking Company, and was also of the family that set up the linen mill at Jennymount in North Belfast. And they lived in a very big house called Castleton, near to Jennymount. And one of his brothers, he had 2 brothers and I think 3 sisters, and one of the brothers inherited the bank and became managing director. Gordon himself spent most of his life travelling and collecting objects, which he then brought back and gave to the Belfast Natural History Society, which formed the first museum in Belfast. And he, with his 2 brothers, also inherited a sugar plantation in St. Vincent. And on that plantation, there were 79 enslaved people. And we know that from the UCL Legacies of Slave Ownership database. So it's very likely that it was the Belfast banking money and the industrial money from Belfast and Jennymount Mill, combined with his inheritance of this estate, that gave him the means to travel the world collecting. And he gave about 350 or more objects then to the Belfast Natural History Society. And for a time, he came back to Belfast and lived in a house called Bideck on the site of what's now the Mater Hospital. It's no longer there, but he had several houses during his lifetime called Bideck, and he eventually died in Melbourne, Australia. So this figure is thought to show and model tattooing patterns. Its exact use isn't unknown, but it's possible that it was used as a kind of a template for tattoos that would be placed on a human. And on the front and on the chest, there's a kind of a vulva mark, which makes people think that it might be a female figure. And it's got obsidian knife designs also on the hips and the shoulders, which suggest maybe that it was used for some sort of a revenge function. It's made of bark cloth or tapa, which comes from the paper mulberry tree. And this tree didn't grow well in Rapa Nui, and for this reason it was a very prized substance. And so it's likely that this is a chiefly figure, or it would have belonged to somebody important of rank in Rapa Nui. The cane frame underneath indicates the bones of the figure, and it also has a very emaciated appearance. But that's partly because it's dried out in the last 190 or so years since it was collected. So any questions or comments or observations about why you chose it?
I just thought it was very interesting.
Yes, it is, yeah. Okay, so during my PhD, I developed this technique for asking people how they relate to objects from other cultures that they see in museums. And it's based on, there's all this writing in kind of post-colonial studies and in museum studies about how museums have othered people from non-Western countries through the way that their cultures have been presented. And it's also based on the idea of us and whether we see ourselves reflected in our museums. And please feel free to critique this method, because part of the function of this interview is to test whether the method works or not. So there's this binary about us and other, and I'm interested in whether people do see objects from world cultures collections in binary ways or not. And also this us and other binary is also based on the idea of, kind of us and them discourse that has existed in Northern Ireland. So if I were to ask you to place this figure in one of these boxes, us or other, or us and other, or other and us, or neither us nor other, would you place this figure in one of these boxes?
Yes, I would say other.
Can you say why?
It's interesting, but I would imagine it's collected at the time for contemporary academics to look at and study and think about the other countries. But today I would be perfectly happy, if that was returned to the island, it being so rare and not being a spoil of war, and not being direct ours, so to speak.
Okay, so but does the story about Gordon Augustus Thompson and his association with Belfast make you feel that it's more us in any way?
No, I think that, as you say, he had. I'd be thinking more about the exploitation of the workers and that provided the money, but not so much that because the piece came back to Belfast and has been here for 150 years, so that's why we should retain it.
Okay, thank you. So you mentioned that you would be willing for it to go back to Easter Island.
Yes.
To whom do you think this object rightfully belongs now?
I would say I didn't agree with the return of the Benin bronzes, but I would agree with the return of the figure. But that's because the Benin bronzes were taken in wartime, in a wartime environment.
And okay, so you think that objects that are taken in war should not be returned?
Oh,
yeah, right?
Yeah, very much.
And why is that?
Because men sacrificed their lives uh, to take those, and a bit like our French eagle, we actually had two eagles. One of them was discarded accidentally on the battlefield and was later captured at Waterloo. But our eagle, the eighth eagle, the original, was actually stolen from the Chelsea Hospital in 1852. And now we're reliably led, or we've been reliably informed, is in Les Invalides. And I think that it's a terrible shame that it's now there and effectively was stolen back.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a really interesting reflection, that you feel that items that were taken in war can more justifiably be retained in some sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because of the in my opinion, the British Army and the colonial forces were there to bring enlightenment and to put down slavery, to put down cannibalism in the greater Benin area, and with the loss of British troops, the honour almost that would be given away by the return, or the honour that is being given away by the return of the Benin bronzes, I don't agree with.
Okay.
The Benin bronzes is slightly complicated in that, sort of following earlier traditions, my limited understanding is that a number of those were actually sold almost like mid-Victorian prize agents after the Indian Mutiny. So the waters are a bit muddied there, but I think it's a complex subject.
Mm. Do you identify with the people? I know that given your forces background, do you identify with the people that would have been involved in the wars?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I actually collect medals to native troops for West Africa who fought for the British forces.
Okay, thank you. So the next object then, we're not going to go through all of these slides, but I'll just go to the next object that you chose. A bit slow to change. So you chose this Buddha figure, and unlike the tapa cloth figure, there's been very little published on it. And also, I haven't done any of my own independent research on it. So what I can tell you about it is limited to what's in the museum catalogue. So this is a Buddha figure, and we know that because it's a Buddha figure and well recognizable for it. And we know that it's a Buddhist figure because it's of a Buddha. It's late 19th or early 20th century. And I've surmised that just from the date at which it was registered. I think it was registered at 1910. Possibly, though, as part of a retrospective catch-up, where the museum was registering a backlog of objects, because a lot of objects have 1910 dates. It was collected by a Major Martin, about whom I haven't been able to find out anything in particular. I could speculate about who he was, but really it would just be speculation. The one kind of reliable fact that's included in the documentation is that it was from India. But where in India, we don't know. And I imagine that if we were talk to an art historian who knows Indian art, they would be able to tell us something about where exactly it came from, given the kind of particular physical form of it and the floral decoration on the plinth and so on. It's notable that it's a lean Buddha, which might also tell that art historian something, as opposed to one of the fatter Buddhas, which come in from different areas. So that's all that I can tell you about it. Why do you think you were drawn to choose it?
I just think it's aesthetic. It's interesting and attractive. There's a very interesting book on the title is something like The British and Buddha, and it was a flirtation that a limited number of British officers and soldiers had with Buddhism, and some of them converted whilst in India, or very few, albeit, but certainly Buddhism was studied by officers, and there are a lot of officers in their spare time. And it was simply because of my interest in India that I thought it was interesting.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of the us and other box, where would you place this Buddha?
I think others and us, because of our involvement in the subcontinent, and although it isn't directly us, we were sort of involved in the collection, and soldiers studied the people and the history of India. So it's interesting from that point. But I think it doesn't look. I'm no expert on ethnographic items, but I think that looks more like a sort of almost a tourist type piece, more so than a very significant artifact like the first item.
Mm-hmm. And when you say we were involved in, I'm paraphrasing, but I think you were saying we were involved in the study of India and of Indian culture.
Yes, well, of course, once a soldier, always a soldier. And when I'm doing the talks in the museum, I will say, we captured the eagle. Soldiers are very much indoctrinated, is the wrong word, but the regimental history is drummed into one, that when it comes time, if it ever comes time, that you remember those who went before, if you have to make similar sacrifices.
Okay, so when you say we, that's a kind of an idea about we, the armed forces?
Yes. And
or is it about we, the regiment? Or does it refer particularly to your regiment?
Not. I think of the army across the board, and to a lesser degree the navy, and of course the relatively young RAF. But no, I don't. I think of just the army as the army. Not there isn't really. Although I say the army is a conglomeration of regiments, every one vying to be entirely different and trying to be much more different than the others.
Thank you very much. So in terms of ownership for this Buddha figure, same questions again. To whom does it rightfully belong now?
I'd be perfectly happy for that to stay where it is.
And what are your reasons for that?
Well, my knowledge is almost zero, but I don't imagine that it is an extremely rare figure of Buddha. Obviously, ones will pop up on the Antiques Roadshow, which the experts swoon over, or that were taken from palaces here and there, or they know the history of. But I think that's probably just either an item for the tourist to buy or for private family devotion.
And what do you think should happen to it in the future? I put some options here in this question number 3.
Well, I think it should stay on display as part of the picture of where the British were, and sort of part of a greater picture of the empire.
Okay, and how about the tablecloth figure? Because I forgot to ask you about that. You said you would be happy for it to be returned.
Yeah, well, yes, being that it's of great significance to the indigenous people, I can understand that, but I do sort of draw that it's self-imposed, or with like the Benin bronzes, which were taken in war, as opposed to a piece that a Georgian businessman picked up on his travels.
Mm. Do you think that if the tapacloth figure were to be returned, there should be any preconditions about whether it's preserved or displayed?
I don't really think so. I think obviously it must be of enough significance that the Easter Islanders will it's their object. So and the fact that there are only a couple in existence, I'm sure they'd be very delighted to get it back.
Okay, thank you. So on to the next question then. This is a puzzle ball of a kind that you may well have seen before, and I think it's from Guangzhou in China. And I'm saying Guangzhou just because that's the area, the region where these puzzle balls were often made. But Guangzhou isn't included in the documentation for the object. It was bought in about 1892 from a Charles L. Grant, I think by the Belfast Museum and Art Gallery, which was on Royal Avenue above the public library. And it's ivory. My understanding is that it's purely decorative and that these objects were bought by visitors to China and brought back as souvenirs. Although I'm sure the spherical kind of form of it has connections with Chinese cosmological beliefs. But what's amazing about these bowls is they're made from one single piece of ivory. So here, this piece, I think from the piece just below the Chinese hat shape down to the pendant that the tassel hangs from is all a single piece of ivory. And it's got 5 concentric balls inside. So it's 5 layers of balls, each individually carved with these incredible sort of L-shaped tiny files. And it's this particular amazing kind of artistry that made these objects very tempting for the acquisitive Westerner. Any questions or comments about it?
No, I picked just because I thought it was very aesthetic. When I look at that and given the date, it wasn't taken at the sacking of Peking. That it is almost it seems wrong to say a tourist item, even albeit a Victorian one. I think it is a tribute to the Chinese craftsmen and should be displayed in Belfast as a tribute, as a fascinating little thing, and a tribute to Chinese craftsmen. I don't think it would be of such significance that the Chinese would ask for that back. I'm sure they've got quite a few much better examples.
That's really interesting. I'd never made the connection before with the Summer Palace. Is that what you're referring to when you're saying the sacking of Peking?
I suspect that that's perhaps what you were going to tell me. Of course, I was wrong. But because so many of the Chinese artifacts that turn up were taken in 1842 or 1860. I think, although not applicable in this case, I think the British in China in 1900, there was less sort of looting going on.
That would be a really interesting line of inquiry for this object, and it's possible that it did come from Peking, but it just can't be told from the documentation whether that might be the case or not.
Yes.
So fascinating. Thank you. So in terms of us and other, where does this puzzle ball belong?
I think either other or possibly other than us. It's very interesting. It could be justified to be on display in Belfast simply because of the artistry and the skill of the craftsmen.
Okay, thank you. And ownership?
I think I think that's I think that's the hardest one of all. It's not us. So I think either other or other and us. I suppose the only us we could say is that it was brought home, like item one, brought home from someone, probably from Northern Ireland.
And if it were to be found out that it had been taken from the Summer Palace or during the sacking of Peking, Beijing, would that change your decision?
That would be complicated by the fact I don't think it's of tremendous significance. So there was tremendous amount of sort of pilfering going on, but yet it's not a military item. It's a trinket's the wrong word, but it's a sort of a very attractive ornament. So I wouldn't have any problems with that going back. You know, in the unlikely event that China wanted it.
Okay. And if it were to go back, would there be any preconditions?
No.
Sorry, I didn't catch that last thing.
So no, I was going to say it's not quite the Elgin marbles.
No. Okay, thank you. So these are the last two slides then. At the beginning of the interview, I asked you about your own perspectives on colonialism in the British Empire and about your own kind of family background and growing up. Did you see symbols of the British Empire and did that shape your identity? And then I asked you about the objects from the National Museum's Northern Ireland collection. Do you think reflecting on your own background before I asked you about the objects changed the way that you responded about the objects, or were they entirely unconnected?
No, I don't think it was interesting, you know, to hear about them, but I don't think it had changed how I thought or how I looked at them.
Okay, thank you. And the very last question then is that I'm thinking as one of the outputs for this project of doing a little website where people reflect on their own identities in connection with an object. And it can be an object from their own lives or any other object that they might choose. Would you be willing to do that? It could be your reflection, could be a short poem or a journal entry or a piece of writing or a label or anything. Any kind of creative response.
Yes.
Thank you. No obligation at all, but just interested in knowing whether people are willing to take part further.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. That's the end of the interview. I'm going to stop presenting and stop the recording.
Bye.